Hello, everybody, and welcome to International Podcast Day 2017. We are celebrating the power of podcasts today. On our event this year, we have Yann, the great Yann from 360 Entrepreneur. He is representing himself, his podcast, his brand, and the country of Finland. Yann, how are you doing this morning?
Good morning, Dave. Hello, everybody, whether it's morning, afternoon, or evening, like in my case.
Exactly, 9 a.m. our time, 7 p.m., correct? Your time?
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. So, Yann, let me introduce you, and then I'll go through our sponsors, and then we'll be off and running. Yann is a four-time podcast host and podcasting consultant. He's the creator of the Podcast Growth Mastermind, which Forbes dubbed Podcast Community to Join. And he's founder of the world's biggest podcasting virtual conference, the Podcast Success Summit. Yann participated in last year's International Podcast Day event, and his contributions and expertise in the podcasting space is always well received. He's going to be sharing strategies and tools you can use to better know your podcast audience. With that said, I'd like to thank the International Podcast Day sponsors. Blueberry is a full-service podcasting company, a turnkey solution that will allow a new or veteran podcaster to get set up and running within 15 minutes. Get started at blueberry.com. Studio 21 Podcast Cafe is a full-service cafe with 2 working podcasting and video casting studios. The grand opening happens September 30th, where they'll be live streaming throughout the day. Learn more and visit them at studio21podcast.cafe. The Messengers, a podcast documentary, is a journey through the modern world of podcasting, uncovering the magic behind why podcasters do what they do. Get your copy of The Messengers in iTunes and on Amazon by visiting themessengersdoc.com. Potable, looking for your next favorite podcast? Potable revolutionizes podcast discovery by providing podcast recommendations tailored to you. Start by going to play.potable.co. That's play.podable.co. And finally, thanks to the Audacity Podcast, the Modern Life Podcast Network, and Podbean. Well, Yann, we really appreciate you again joining our international celebration of podcasting. We are really looking forward to the strategies and tools that you're going to be sharing with us. Welcome to the broadcast, and we're really going to enjoy what you're going to have to share.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you so much. Hello, everybody. This has been an incredible day so far. I've checked a few of the sessions, including the previous one, and it has been a fantastic day. Do you agree? Let me know in the chat. I'm gonna keep an eye on the chat. Let me know if you enjoy it. Yes, exclamation points, hearts, emojis, whatever is the best way for you to express yourself. And also let me thank you, Dave, Steve, Daniel, and all of the International Podcast Day team, the sponsors, everybody joining us. It's such an amazing job you do, and thank you really for having me. And for everybody who's joining me, I see Nancy who says yes, exclamation point. For everybody who's joining me here in the chat, I've just shared a link. Feel free to click on it, and it's basically for a tweet I pre-written. So join me in helping International Podcast Day be known. So if you don't mind tweeting that out and help everybody, your friends, your community know about International Podcast Day, and they can join us here. As Dave said, my name is Yann Ilunga. I'm the host of a few podcasts. I'm a podcasting consultant. I have the Podcast Growth Mastermind community. Thank you, Nancy, so much. And I'm excited to be back here. As Dave said, I've been here before. I'm based in Finland, so I'm honored to be representing Finland yet again. And I'm really excited about the topic of this session here. And as you'll see, some of the things I'm gonna share here with you actually tie into what the previous panel was all about, which is perfect. So I think that if you've watched the previous session, you're definitely gonna see some thread in between the two sessions, which I think is great. And I have some slides for you. So I'm gonna share my screen. I'm gonna be back toward the end, so I'll make sure that we have a few minutes in case you have some questions. Before I share my screen, a quick note. I'm gonna share some strategies, some resources. You don't have to take notes because I've compiled what I talk about in a PDF, and later on I'll tell you how you can get it. So you can really sit back, relax. If it's afternoon or evening where you are, pour yourself a little bit of wine. If it's morning, cup of coffee, tea, milk, cereals, whatever it is. Thank you, Jason, for the love. And who is ready? Let me know in the chat. I'm gonna grab a sip of water, and if you guys are ready, I'm fired up, as you can tell. So let me know in the chat, and we're gonna rock and roll. Well, I see Stephanie, breakfast wine. Well, everybody does things their own way. All right, so I'm gonna jump now and share my slides here with everybody, and we are gonna be off and running. So now you should be able to see my slides. Can you let me know in the chat? Just yes, no. I actually have my iPad here with me as well, so I can keep an eye on the chat. So if you don't mind confirming that you're able to see a slide with a blue background, I would appreciate it, so I can really get started and make sure that you guys can see it. I see Nancy who says, let's roll. Okay, thank you, Nancy. Perfect. So we are off and running. So the topic of this session is know your audience. And I have to tie into the previous session because Adela talked about audience versus community, and I agree with her so much. And personally, I prefer to talk about community rather than audience, but I wanted to use the word audience in the title on purpose because I think by the end of this session, you're going to understand, in case you haven't already with the previous panel, why it's really important to focus on community as an engaged and active group of people rather than audience, which typically tends to have a more passive connotation. So why should you, as a podcaster, care about this topic, about getting to know your audience? First of all, because the more you know about the audience, the better you know about the content to create, where to promote it, and how. In addition to that, if you're interested in leveraging podcast advertising or things like that, you're also going to get more details on your audience. You're going to get more details on your audience that then you can share if you're working with an agency or if you're working with companies directly that are interested in advertising on your podcast. In addition to that, there is also the third point, which I think is important, and is if you have a business related to your podcast, then the more you know about the people who gravitate toward what you do, the better understanding you have of your market. Therefore, you're going to know what to create, product, services, and things like that. So these are three reasons why I think it's important for us as podcasters to really take a moment and think about the people who are around us and try to get to know more about them as much as possible. Now, what do podcasters typically know about? I'm gonna generalize a little bit here, so don't get this kind of take this with a grain of salt. But typically, when it comes to their audience, a podcaster knows things like their taste, because they look at the number of downloads and they can tell, okay, this is the most popular episode, or these are the most popular episodes, and things like that. And if you see me look around every now and then, as I said, I have my iPad here, so I'll keep an eye on the chat. In addition to that, typically we also know where our audience is. If we look through our media hosting, we're able to see where people are listening from. We also know about the technology, so how they listen to our podcast. Is it with iTunes? Is it with SoundCloud? Is it with Stitcher? Is it with something else? And then certain media hosting provide us with additional information. For example, Spreaker, since is a platform that allows you to broadcast your podcast live, the information they give you is also related to the time sphere. So did the person listen on demand? Did they tune in live? Did they download your podcast? I know Podbean has what they call user engagement, so how people interact with your content. And then Libsyn, for example, offers the traffic sources. And, there is a lot of different media hostings, but this is typically what I dare to say, 9 podcasters out of 10 typically know, or at least think about when it comes to knowing your audience. It goes without saying that in terms of media hostings, there are a lot of options. Here I mentioned 4: Libsyn, Spreaker, Podbean, Blueberry. You may be using something different, and that's actually okay. It's not a problem. And the idea here is to make sure that you leverage a media hosting that allows you, I mean, there are many different reasons why you should consider using a media hosting, but in particular, you want to use a media hosting that provides you with some information on your audience. And the one you are currently using probably does that already, which is great. And that's typically what most podcasters do. Now, I want to take things up a notch and really share a few strategies and tools with you. And in case you are joining me and everybody else here in International Podcast Day, and you actually don't have a podcast yet, stick around, because toward the end of the presentation, I'm going to share a couple of things you can do to kind of get to know more about your ideal audience, even if you don't have people around you yet because you haven't started a podcast, or perhaps you have literally just launched it last week. Why email? There is a lot of different reasons why email, but in particular is because leveraging email allows you to have a two-way communication with your audience. If you think about it, typically the interaction we have as podcasters is pretty one-sided. We share our message. Perhaps we have a co-host or guests, but our listeners typically don't get to jump in, interact with us, or they don't get to do so in real time. Perhaps, they send us a tweet or something after an episode has been published and really resonates with them. But typically that doesn't really happen in real time. And also something that we really have to keep in mind is that with email, we have control. So we can definitely do whatever we like. And if you think about it, platforms like iTunes, for example, it's controlled by Apple. Of course, your email is controlled by your email service provider. But the point is that if iTunes were to change their ecosystem tomorrow, they won't ask us for permission. So it's important as podcasters to leverage your email. Now, when it comes to your email, there is a strategy that you can leverage that is very, very powerful. And it's pretty easy to use. And it's having an email sequence and having a question that says, what's the number one thing blank? And the reason why I say blank is that this will vary depending on your podcast, depending on the topic, depending on your community. If you are into the online business space or internet marketing space, you may have seen some people who have an email that says, what's the number one thing you're struggling with right now? So that could be a question. And the idea with this email is that to try to keep it as an open-ended question. So typically the goal of this email is to have it be as simple as possible and trigger interaction. So you want to have people who are on your email list get used to the idea that you are all about having a two-way conversation. So it's not you bombarding them with your podcast episodes, your tweets, your emails, you have it, but it's about you sharing something, perhaps asking questions, and then replying or asking questions of their own. So if you keep it as an open-ended question, you're gonna be amazed by what happens. Some people are really gonna take the time to share, their story. You're gonna get even some long emails. And what is good about that is that as you start to go through the different emails, you're gonna start to identify trends. You're gonna see that people often refer to a specific topic from a certain angle. Perhaps you notice that the wording is similar. People often use similar sentences, similar concepts. And the reason why that is important is that, number one, it helps you start to understand more about the people who are around you. But it's also useful, especially if you have a business related to your podcast, because what you can do, perhaps at some point you create a product or a service that is actually related to the pain points your community has. And on your sales page or on your landing page, what's not, you can then use the exact same wording or approach the topic from the perspective people use in their email. And people are going to feel like, wow, I really feel as if Yann is talking to me. This really strikes a chord with me. So that's why it's a pretty good idea to keep it as an open-ended question. If you want to be more strategic, perhaps you already have some ideas on what the general level is, then you can even be more narrow it down a little bit further, and perhaps you can provide people with a few options. So if there are, let's say, certain subtopics you cover, you could share those with them. Let's say you have a podcast about, I don't know, about traveling. You could ask, for example, and you share traveling tips, let's say. Your question in the email could be something like, what's the continent you would like to hear more about? America, Europe, Africa, Asia. So in that case, you would provide people with some options. So you can go about it in two ways. If you aren't sure, I would encourage you then to go with the open-ended question, which is perfect. An additional thing that is worth looking into is to create a survey. And I know that survey, when we think about survey, typically a survey isn't really a sexy thing. It feels like a boring thing, because typically we are on the other end of the spectrum. So we are the people filling out the survey, but the survey can actually be pretty useful for you if set up correctly, or if you ask the right questions. And in case you're wondering what type of questions you should be asking, stick around, because later on in the presentation, I actually have a slide where I address that specific point. So if you're here and you're like, well, Yann, all this sounds great, but what should I ask people about? I'm gonna help you with that. When it comes to your survey, you may be asking yourself, well, how often should I send a survey? Should I send it once a week, once a month, once a year, every 5 years? My piece of advice would be, you want to send it as often as you want it to be. It goes without saying that if you send a survey to people every single day, people are going to be really annoyed. I would say in the worst case scenario, once a year could be a good amount. It could be at the end of the year, at the beginning of the year. Perhaps you have, let's say you launched your podcast during the summer and your podcast's 1 year anniversary is coming up. Perhaps that's a good time to kind of, or a good date to connect to a survey. So you want to definitely leverage a survey. And when it comes to the goal of your survey, it goes without saying that the more straight to the point, the better. So I'm not saying to send a survey that has 500 questions, because people may go through it once, but that's it, they won't do it again. So what you want to do is to really peel it out and focus on information you aren't able to get through the points I mentioned before. If you think about the media hosting, for example, it already gives you some information on your audience. So I personally wouldn't include questions related to those points in the form. So I would focus on questions that people are able to answer and that you wouldn't get to know about them otherwise, or at least not through your media hosting. So when it comes to surveys, I'm gonna share a few different tools that you can use, and they are free to use, which is great. So the first one is Google Forms, and we're gonna take a quick look at all of them individually. The second one is called Typeform, and the third one, it's a new one. It's currently in beta version called Pod Profile. I'm gonna take a quick sip of water and I'll be right back. All right, Google Forms, the name says it, is owned by Google. It's free to set up and use, and the only thing you need really to get started with it is to have a Gmail account. If you have a Gmail email, then you can use Google Forms. If you have been using Google Docs, Google Drive, any other Google tool, then you're able to use Google Forms. Here you see an example of what a form may look like. I put some multiple choice questions. The forms are completely customizable and they're really drag and drop. So even if you don't know the first thing about coding or all this kind of things, you don't have to worry. You can literally drag and drop things around. So Google Forms, definitely worth looking into. And as I said, again, it's free to set up and use. One tool I love and I use for so many different things is called Typeform, as I said in the previous slide. And Typeform has both a free and premium plan. But in order to set up let's say a basic form or survey, you'll be able to do that with the free plan. I use the free plan. And I use Typeform also for other things like customer support as well. So it's very powerful. And you see here, you see the design. You can really customize it so that the colors are really the same colors of your branding, and you can add elements, and you can have a lot of different types of questions. A similar thing can be said for Google Forms, but I think that especially from the design point of view, Typeform is more powerful. And one thing that I also like about Typeform is, and I'm not sure about Google Forms because I haven't used it that much, but with Typeform, you can also connect it to your email so that you get a notification. For example, for me that I use it for customer service, whenever somebody submits a request, a ticket through Typeform, I get an email informing them of the specific request. So I don't have to be staring at my Typeform dashboard 24/7. I can just keep an eye on my email, and then through my email, I can go there and check out. So Typeform, definitely worth looking into. The site is typeform.com. And the third option, as I said, is a new tool. It is currently in beta version. The site is podprofile.com. And I was introduced to this tool by the co-creator, Glenn Rubenstein from Adopter Media. And the reason why I wanted to mention Pod Profile, even though I haven't used it myself, is that it is a tool, unlike Typeform and Google Forms, it is a tool designed for podcasters. So while Google Forms and Typeform weren't designed with us in mind, Pod Profile, or the goal of Pod Profile, is really to help us podcasters. So that's why I believe it's definitely worth looking into. And again, the site is podprofile.com. What are you guys thinking so far about what I'm sharing here? Does it make sense? Have you perhaps already gotten some ideas on how you can implement these things? Let me know in the chat. I told you I'm keeping an eye on the chat, so I'll make sure to then address any point or question you may have before we wrap things up here. Okay, so this was for the tools to build surveys. There are a bunch of other tools. You may be using one already. If that's the case, great. Go for that if you're happy. If you aren't using anything, definitely take a look into these three tools. Why is it important for us to really think about community? Was discussed early on. It's because podcast listening is an individual experience. If you think about it, I don't remember the last time I had friends over and I was like, well, hey, let's all listen to a podcast. That doesn't really happen. Perhaps we have a conversation about a podcast. We share, oh, you should really listen to this show or this episode. But typically, people who listen to us, they do so by themselves. Why is it important for us as podcasters to keep podcast listening in mind? Is because once we have that in mind, we have to make sure that we do one thing. And this was talked about in the previous session, and is build a community. We want to build a community, and we want to build a community so that people can or have access to us, but also they have access to each other's. And this, again, was mentioned in the previous session, and I think it's so true. So we should focus as podcasters on creating a common ground, and this could be something that we do for our own show. It could be a common ground that we build as a collaborative efforts with other podcasters or something like that. But we want basically to have some kind of way for our listeners to gather, interact with us, have access to one another, and so forth. And it goes without saying that face-to-face is great, but here in this presentation, I'm going to talk about online, because you may be in a different area, different city, different country, different continent. than your community or than most of your community. Like in my case, most of the people who are in my community, most of my clients are actually in a different continent than I am. So it's important to really think about the online space. If you have the ability to organize in-person events, meetups, great, definitely go for them. But keep in mind that even if you organize those, the online element can still help you with the more frequent interactions. So you may have, let's say, a monthly meetup, but what are you going to do to keep in touch with people during the rest of the month? Well, that's where a couple of online resources may come into play. Here for this presentation, I want to focus on Facebook groups specifically. There may be forums, Slack communities. There are a bunch of different options, but the reason why I would recommend a Facebook group is, first of all, is easy to set up. Most people know how Facebook works, or at least most people who have access to the internet and use social media, then they know how Facebook works. And that's important because you want to make sure that you use a platform that your community feels comfortable using. I think that's key. So Facebook groups are definitely worth looking into. And there are a few things about Facebook groups in particular that I think it's important for us to focus on. And this is a recent thing. Facebook recently enabled the group insights feature, which means that now as people who manage a Facebook group, we have a snapshot on what's happening. We have information on the activity, the engagement, the most engaged members, the most popular posts, the most popular days of the weeks or times to post and all this kind of thing. So all those elements really help us in getting to know more about our community. So what are the topics that they're really interested in the most? What are the most popular questions, the frequently asked questions? Among our community members, who are those who are always there for us, who are happy to help us, are happy to help other community members and all those kind of things. I personally believe that this is all information we want to know about. And that's why I'm really happy about the group insights of Facebook groups. So that's one reason. An additional reason why I think it's great to leverage a Facebook group is that there is a tool called Facebook Polls that you can leverage, and it allows you to really, really interact with the community. Here you see an example of a poll I posted, and you can see from the answer that there was quite the engagement. People really interacted with it. There was over 100 respondents, which is great. So again, when it comes to getting to know more about your community, you can think that having a Facebook group, for example, may allow you to have a more frequent interaction. So early on when I was talking about the surveys, I said, let's say, send a survey once a year. If you have a Facebook group, perhaps you can have a poll every quarter or every 6 months. So a Facebook poll feels like less work for your community members typically. So that's why I think it's an asset worth looking into. And then there is another very powerful asset that is available only if you manage a closed Facebook group. I manage a closed Facebook group. I'm not sure about secret groups. I know that in the previous session, it was the aspect of having rules for a Facebook group was touched upon. This isn't a session all about Facebook groups, so we won't go into that. But personally, I believe that having, for me at least, for what I do, having a closed Facebook group for podcasters has been great. And what has even been better is setting up some questions. You see here, anybody who requests to join the group, and if you're interested in learning more about the group, I'll tell you about it at the end, and you're more than welcome to join. And you're actually going to see these 3 questions. So I ask people who request to join 3 questions. The first one is, where did you hear about the group? The second one is, do you have a podcast? And the third one is, I give I think 5 topics, and I ask, what's the number one thing you're interested in learning more about? And then there are the options. So what this does is it allows me, as soon as somebody requests to join the group and fills out or answers these questions, what this does is it allows me to start to get to know about that person even before I let them in the group, which is a pretty cool thing if you think about it. So I start to get to know more about people who want to gravitate toward what I do before they're actually part of the group itself, which I think is pretty powerful. Another asset, and this is also a pretty new thing, but it's been very, very powerful for me at least, and for what I do, is to use quizzes. And quizzes can be used for many different reasons. They can be used to grow your email list. They can be used to drive traffic. But I personally use a quiz to get to know more about my audience. So I'll tell you about how I leverage quizzes in a second. But first, I want to mention a couple of resources you can use if you are interested in using quizzes. One is called Thrive Quiz Builder. Is favorite of mine. It's actually what I use. Is a WordPress plugin. So you need to have a WordPress site in order to use it. And I really like the picture they have there because the iceberg concept, I think it's so true. And they basically tell you that, yeah, typically we only see the tip of the iceberg, but through a quiz, we can really get to know more. We can really explore the iceberg all the way from top to bottom. Thrive Quiz Builder, as I said, it works only with WordPress. If you're interested in using my affiliate link, you see it here, yannilunga.com/quiz builder, and is another resource that you can use. It's not a free tool, so you have to pay, but they have a one-time payment, which is great, and it's really drag and drop. So again, even if you aren't a technical person, you're able to set a quiz up. Another tool that is pretty cool to use, or actually, sorry, a quick note before I talk about the second tool. One thing that I love about Thrive Quiz Builder, or the way I use quizzes here in my journey in learning more about my community, is that Thrive Quiz Builder has a very good analytics section. So you see here, for example, I have a quiz. Basically, the way I use quizzes is when a person is interested in one of the main lead magnets I have on my site, they click a button and they see a window that says something like, hey, I just want to make sure that I provide you with as much relevant content as possible. So before you get the freebie, do you mind answering a couple of questions? And then they go through the quiz. And the cool thing about, for me personally, having it like this is that similarly to the Facebook group, by having the quiz set up like this, I get to know a lot about a person as soon as they join my email list. So I don't even have to send them an automated email or anything like that, because they go through the quiz and then I can go back and look at the analytics. So as you can see from this snapshot on the right-hand side, there is the percentage. So certain questions, it goes without saying that certain questions are more relevant than others, but this really takes away the guesswork. Having these kind of tools in place really helps you understand how you can serve your community in the best possible way, especially if you have a podcast that has an informational or educational purpose. But even if it's entertaining, your goal, or perhaps you want to inspire people, the more you get to know about the audience, the better you know how to go about making them laugh, inspire them, or something like that. The second tool I want to mention that you can use to build quizzes as well as calculators is called Outgrow, and their site is outgrow.co. And in case you're wondering what a calculator is, here I have an example. So this screenshot says, looking to build an app, find out how much it will cost in different regions. So if you think numbers perhaps is monetary component or something like that, it's something your community is interested in learning more about, then you may want to have a calculator. Perhaps you want to say to people, let's say you have a podcast about productivity, and you could use a calculator to show people how many hours they waste on, I don't know, on social media or watching Netflix or something like that. Now, let's talk about what you can do if you don't have an audience. And a quick note, what I'm about to share is something you can do even if you have an audience, but particularly so if you're asking yourself, well, what if I don't have anybody to ask questions, to send surveys, to send quizzes to. What should I do? Well, I have a couple of strategies for you. The first thing that it has been so much powerful, and I still do this, and I personally believe all of us should do this, is to do social media listening. As podcasters, especially independent ones, sometimes we almost are desperate. We want to let everybody know about our podcast. So we try to set up automated Twitter private messages and whatever to really try to share our podcast. I want you, if that has been you up until now, I would like you to start looking at social media from a different angle. Look at it as an asset that you can leverage to really pay attention to the conversation that it's happening and join the conversation. Listen, ask questions, answer, and something like International Podcast Day here. And remember to use the hashtag International Podcast Day. It's something that actually can help you as well. So even if you are the type of person who doesn't necessarily like to put yourself out there, you can still really pay attention to the conversation. What are the questions people ask often when it comes to the topic you're interested in covering with your upcoming podcast? Really pay attention to the conversation. You can leverage communities. This was discussed also in the previous session, and it's so true. Remember that Facebook groups, whether you are the one managing one or you're part of one, Facebook groups are a space for people. So if you are the admin of the group, remember, the group has to be about the people, not about you pushing your show. That's not what a Facebook group is about. A Facebook group is about conversations, about community building. And if you don't have a Facebook group, you aren't interested in starting one, and you're kind of wanting to know more about people in your space, you can look for Facebook groups, forums, Slack communities, or any type of online communities in your space. Join those and see what people are saying. Again, join the conversation. And here's an example of a poll that was posted in my group, the Podcast Growth Mastermind. And you see here, this one was posted by a member. I decided to kind of cover the person who posted it. I didn't think she would have minded, but still, here you see that people were receptive. So she wanted to crowdsource something. She posted a poll, and that's something you can do as well. So you see that there is some power to you, even if you aren't the one that manages the Facebook group. If you're using Twitter, I have a great hack for you. This has been great, and is instead of manually going to Twitter and see what's happening, you can leverage a tool like Hootsuite and set up a stream and track specific terms. For example, here is a screenshot of a stream that I set up related to tweets that feature a question about podcast guest. It goes without saying that the tool isn't 100% accurate. Sometimes there are certain tweets included. Let's say if somebody sends out tweet that's like, I love my podcast guests. Do you? That may be not very relevant for you, but it would still appear in your stream. But the reason why I like this hack and using Hootsuite is that it allows you to easily keep track of the conversation and do so from one specific platform or app, because they also have the app. And then you can also interact with people through Hootsuite. So you can retweet, answer, and those kind of things. So if you're interested in keeping an eye on the conversation or even jumping in the conversation on Twitter, I would encourage you to look at Hootsuite and set up a stream or even several streams. Perhaps you want to focus on several aspects. And if you're interested in questions, you can add a question mark at the end of your keyword, or even just a keyword. So that's for social media listening using Hootsuite. If you want to use Twitter directly, one thing that you could do is to use Twitter polls. Here you see an example of actually how Twitter used a Twitter poll. So here they were basically wondering, okay, for our community, should we share more tips and tricks type of content or more news about features, updates, and these kind of things? Well, they didn't have to wonder. They just crowdsourced, basically. They asked people, and people let them know. And you can do the same. If you have a Twitter community, a pretty engaged one, or Twitter following, then you could easily set up Twitter polls, and Twitter polls are are available to everybody. I don't think you need any special account. If you have a Twitter account, you are able to send out polls. It goes without saying that you should try to send them to relevant people. Now, about the not having an audience, I mentioned social media. If all of those things feel like, well, that's already too narrowed down, I'm literally just getting started, then you could look at a site like Quora.com, which is a site where people ask questions and get answers. So what this would help you with is especially with the content side of things. Here you see a screenshot. I entered the word scuba diving, I believe. And if I had a podcast about scuba diving, and perhaps I was thinking about, I wonder what type of content I should create my episode or my next episodes around. Well, here I definitely would have a couple of ideas, because here I see somebody asking, is it possible to scuba dive with contact lenses? And somebody else asks about the geography. So this would definitely give you some ideas. And the cool thing about using something like Quora.com, or even monitoring questions people ask on Twitter, and then you create your content around them, is that basically you have a listener even before you create a content. Because if somebody asks you, hey, is it possible to use contact lenses in scuba diving, and you create a podcast episode that is all about that, and you give a kind of a more in-depth explanation, you could easily reply to the person on Quora or Twitter and say, yeah, absolutely. And actually, I talked about that in my latest episode. Feel free to check it out. Here's the link. And well, guess what? If a person asked a question, it's because they're interested in the answer. So they will probably tune in. So that's definitely a great way to find listeners. And if you do a good job, guess what? They're going to be back. So Quora.com is worth checking out. What are you guys thinking so far? Does it make sense? I'm about to wrap it up so we can address some questions you may have, but let me know in the chat. Does it make sense? How have you felt so far? I see Dan, I see John says that I love this tip. I say Eddie, hi Eddie. Great, John, that you've been using Typeform. You bet. I see Summer saying it's great. So let me know here in the chat. Yeah. I see Summer, sorry, not Summer, Nancy Sommer, my bad. Thank you so much. And yeah, so this last part of the presentation is about what I should ask about. I mean, let's face it, we've talked about tools, we've talked about a few strategies, we've talked about how often should I send a survey, how should I go about them? Should I use a poll? But what should we ask about? I mean, that's the golden question, right? What can we ask so that it's relevant and it's also useful and it helps us get a better picture of our community? Well, I have a couple of tips for you. So I believe there are three key areas. One has to do with the person. So things like gender, age, employment, their location, marital status or relationship status, income level. And it goes without saying that this first point or certain parts of this first point will vary depending on your podcast. For example, something like the relationship status or income level, even the geographical location may not be something that you care about because they don't really play a key role in the bigger picture that is your podcast, perhaps your business and things like that. But typically think about questions that help you get, let's say, an identikit in a way of your listener. So again, ask questions related to things like the gender, the age, whatever you deem relevant. The second key area, I think, has more to do with the kind of emotional / rational sphere. So things like goals, pain points, challenges, struggles, these kind of things. So that's definitely something you want to ask questions around, and perhaps that may even be, in certain cases, more relevant than the other two key areas. But personally, I believe that a good form or a good survey or something like that includes questions from all of these areas. And the third and final area, has to do more with the kind of, let's say, the light or fun side of things. So things like interests, passions, hobbies. I don't know if, let's say, if you have a podcast about a TV show, perhaps it's, yeah, what is your favorite? Let's say you have a podcast where you discuss the TV show The Walking Dead. Perhaps a question like, what's your favorite Walking Dead character, or something like that, would go in the third triangle, the one on the right. So to recap, think about the person in terms of who they are, so the gender, the age, employment, blah, blah, blah. Then think about the rational sphere, the emotional sphere, so things like goals, aspirations, struggles, challenges, and so forth. And then the third one, the kind of other or fun things, interest, hobbies, passions, and so forth. So this is it in terms of slides. So still have some minutes here for some questions. And I said early on that I actually compiled the things I've talked about. And if you go to this page, yannilunga.com, so that's my site, yannilunga.com/IPD17, so it's for International Podcast Day. There you can download the PDF where I compiled the different resources I mentioned in this presentation. So yannilunga.com/IPD17. I'm going to share that in the chat as well. And on the same page, you're also going to find the link to join the Podcast Growth Mastermind. The Podcast Growth Mastermind is a Facebook community all about podcasting. We have over 1,600 members from literally every single continent, and you're more than welcome to join. We're having conversations about different topics related to podcasting and becoming a better podcaster. And we have podcasters from all different walks of the podcasting journey. People who have been thinking about starting a podcast, people who are about to launch the podcast, people who have literally just launched their show, as well as people who have been podcasting for a few months, few years, or even more than just a few years. So again, all those things, the invitation to join the Facebook group, a PDF with the resources mentioned in this presentation, you find them over at yannilunga.com/IPD17. Now I'm gonna stop sharing my screen so I can come back and focus here, and I'm gonna still be around if you have a few questions. Thank you, Nancy. Looking forward to seeing you into the Facebook group. So I'm gonna add the link here in the chat. So this is the link of the page I mentioned. Feel free to go over there. You can get the PDF with the resources I mentioned, and there is also a button to join the Facebook group. Now I'm here for a couple more minutes, so I'm all ears. Do you have any questions, thoughts, comments? You bet, US Citizen Pod, my pleasure. Do you have anything to say? I'm here, so let me know what your thoughts are. Do you think the presentation, it's something that was useful for you? Have you seen a couple of things I talked about that sparked some ideas? I'm an open book and I'm curious. So questions, comments, feedbacks, let me know here in the chat. That's a great question. So I see a question. Does the time zone affect your ability to connect with Facebook group members? So I have a great tip for that. And actually, I believe, John, it was you who earlier asked about community building tips. So for example, for me, what I do, I manage my Facebook group by myself. What I do is, since it's quite the international group, I dedicate a few minutes in different parts of the day. For example, a few minutes after breakfast, a few minutes in the afternoon, and a few minutes in the evening. So that makes sure that I'm in there interacting with people who may be present at different times. So for example, members from Australia and the West Coast in the States are typically people I interact with more in the morning. People based here in Europe are people who I interact, and Europe as well as Asia and Africa are people who I interact with in the afternoon portion, and in the evening it's especially people in Europe and people in the US. And mind you, when I talk about a chunk of time, I'm not talking about 5 hours every day. I'm talking about 5-10 minutes in the morning, 5-10 minutes in the afternoon, 5-10 minutes in the evening. So you can definitely do that. And keep in mind that as your group grows, so will the engagement. So sometimes people ask questions, and by the time I get to the questions, others have already jumped in, which is great. And actually, I believe that as a person who manages a Facebook group, you shouldn't be the one who kind of answers questions first all the time and things like that. I see you, a citizen. What is your favorite social media app? That's a good question. Well, my go-to social media platform is Twitter. It has been fantastic for me to connect with people, to find guests. Twitter is great, and typically you can connect with people, or sorry, you can interact with people even if you aren't connected, unless they have a private Twitter account. Otherwise, you can interact with people. So that, for me, that has been great, and I've used it as a kind of as an icebreaker. But for the community side of things, I have to say that the Facebook group has been fantastic, even as a member. So I'm also a member of other Facebook groups about podcasting, and I have to say that, yeah, it has been a great medium. So I would say Twitter as an icebreaker, and Facebook group in particular for the community side of things. Yeah, I know, Nancy. Yeah, Twitter is expanding their limits, even though I'm not sure how much that will impact the platform, because I think, it's nice in a way to have those limits. For me personally, a quick note on Facebook. I believe that when it comes to community, a Facebook group it's the way to go, and not a Facebook page. You're a citizen. You asked me, do you contact people via Twitter personal message to ask them to be a guest? Sometimes yes, sometimes even with a direct tweet. Perhaps sometimes what I will do is I send them an email, and then on Twitter I send them a tweet with like, you got mail, with a meme or a funny gif or something like that. But it doesn't make much of a difference. It goes without saying that some people don't check their DMs. So if you're sending private messages, you want to make sure that they check their bio, because some people say, I don't read DMs. John, any favorite Facebook groups you're a member of? Well, yeah, about podcasting, there is quite many. Obviously, I mentioned the Podcast Growth Mastermind, so make sure to join in case you haven't already. There is the one about podcast movement. There is what is called Podcasting Smarter. There are quite many Facebook groups. What is the best way to contact a host if you think you're a good fit for their show? That's a great question, Nancy. Well, I would say that, first of all, you want to check their site, because perhaps they already have some information on that. So maybe they have a form or something like that. If they don't, I personally would say that you have more success, and this is true even as a host. If you want to interact, if you're interested in being interviewed or interview somebody, I believe that you increase your chances if you position yourself as somebody who they know, or at least who is a beep on their radar. So if you just cold email people, whether it's a guest or host, they're probably going to be like, I wonder who this person is. But perhaps if you start a conversation with them, let's say on Twitter, maybe you curate their content, so you share their podcast episodes, or you give them an iTunes review or something like that, and then you reach out to them. That is definitely effective. Okay, so why do I think Facebook group is better than a Facebook page? Is because a Facebook page, let's say the ecosystem and the conversation is more one directional, meaning it's you, let's say it's you or the admin typically promoting something, whereas a Facebook group is more, let's say, with a Facebook page, you have a vertical relationship with your community members. So you are here and everybody else is down here. Whereas with a Facebook group, you are pretty much having an horizontal relationship. You're all pretty much at the same level. I showed you the example of the poll. So one of the polls I showed was actually posted by a member of the group who isn't an admin or anything like that. So I think that for community building, a Facebook group has more to offer, especially for people who are members. So not for you as the admin. I hope the explanation makes sense. I'm thinking guesting may be a good way to test my topic in a positive ways. Yes, that makes sense. Always good to. Yeah, yes, Nancy, exactly. And you know, that's how I've interviewed New York Times bestselling authors, top entrepreneurs, blah blah blah. And people ask me, oh, how did you land those interviews? Is because I have I've connected with them first. I built a relationship first a little bit. I wasn't just a random person. I was somebody who curated the content, put myself in front of them, and then I reached out to them. Vertical versus horizontal conversation. Well, yeah, conversation or even relationship, meaning that a Facebook group, people all have pretty much the same amount of power, let's say, whereas with the Facebook page, you have more power. And also with the Facebook page, their reach is limited. So let's say if you have 1,000 people who like your Facebook page and you post something, only a small percentage of them will see it. Whereas with a Facebook group, at least up until today, that isn't the case. So when you post something out in your Facebook group, people, in theory, every member sees it. A final note maybe I would make, unless you guys have other questions, a note I would make about Facebook groups, at least in my opinion, is I would encourage you not to create a group around your podcast and just use it to promote your podcast. I would build it around a topic that you and your podcast listeners are interested in. So you want to find that sweet spot, at least in my opinion. For example, my group is about podcasting. And sometimes if we have a conversation about a certain topic and I have a podcast episode about that, I may answer the question and then say, hey, by the way, I talked about that more in depth in this specific episode. But I would encourage you not to make the mistake some people make of building a group and just using it as a way to just bombard your community members with promotion after promotion after promotion, because at some point people are gonna say, you know what, I'm gonna look for a different group. So really think about what you are focused on, what you are doing, what your community is interested in, and build a Facebook group around that. I have 1 more minute if anybody has an additional question. If not, thank you so much for joining me here. Thank you for being part of International Podcast Day. And again, a final note, I'm just gonna repaste the link 1 more time here in the chat. So here on this link, in case you're just joining, you can get the PDF with the resources I mentioned, and you can also get there is the link to join the Facebook group. Yann, Quora.com is very powerful and is still pretty underutilized, which is it's a pity because it's a great tool. All right, if anybody has 1 more question. Okay, I see periodically pod. I've never heard of Quora. It's basically if you know what Yahoo Answers, or was it Yahoo Questions, I don't remember, is the type of a site. Basically, people ask questions on Quora. People ask questions about anything, like really about from topics like how to tie a tie to, I don't know, to how to build a house. It's really anything Q&A related, and it's definitely a resource looking into, especially if one is looking for ideas for podcast episodes and things like that.
Well, Yann, thank you so much for taking part in International Podcast Day once again. The strategies and tools you shared is a great way to connect with our podcast audience. So we really appreciate it. Thank you for representing yourself, your podcast, your message, your expertise, and of course, Finland during International Podcast Day 2017. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you, Dave. Hi, Steve and Daniel. And thank you guys for putting together this incredible event. And thank you, everybody, for being here.
Absolutely. Happy International Podcast Day, everybody. We will see you soon.